Good morning. I want to talk a little bit about last night's playtest of Dark Age of Man. Kevin graciously offered on Friday, last night, to run a second session within a week, which was fantastic. And this time we had Eric and Robert join us, and that can be seen here on the channel here at Roleplay Cafe. So if you're interested in just watching the actual play, and I think we talk a little bit about the experience at the end of the game as well. I think we recorded that. I don't remember if we did. But I want to talk about a couple of things. And this is not just related to Dark Age of Man. It's related to gaming in general, but in particular role-playing. And some of this was talked about last night, I think, when it comes in relationship to what the goal is of our game and what the mechanics are there to do, or what the mechanics, the lack of mechanics are there to do. So one of the things, and Dell mentioned this yesterday in a text, just in a kind of a passing thought, I think, he had mentioned he didn't want the naive narrator portion of our game to kind of get pushed back or lost in the rules or lost in the process, which we can't control. We can write it and we can give it as an opportunity and a way for GMs to go about running our game, or any game. You can't make GMs run games a particular way. They're going to run games the way they're comfortable. They're going to run the games the way hopefully the system demands they run the games. If a system is putting limitations upon a GM, for instance, the best example I have of that is 2D20, for instance, Doom and Thread, right? A GM cannot just do a thing without spending a resource to do a thing. So it makes the GM in a way accountable, makes the GM a player, so to speak. And it allows there to be a give and take between the players and the GM in a meta way, right? But one of the things that concerns me about mechanics in games is whether they're superficial or not. The mechanics must be necessary to the process of the game itself, or they must be necessary or utilized properly, or they must be ultimately extraneous and therefore unnecessary. And I do believe some games create mechanics that are often irrelevant or forgotten or unnecessary. Therefore, they were maybe designed for a particular reason. They were put into place for a particular goal, or they were put into play or taken literally in expectation of teaching people how to do the thing via a rule book. Right? And I'm not going to talk about examples of where there are mechanics in games that are irrelevant or pointless or worthless or superficial, or because that would be utterly a matter of opinion, right? And which everything I say is anyway. But I'm not going to cherry pick something or pick on something. So for me, I want to talk about a couple of things here. One, our system of character generation is designed for a player to look at two pages, see what they're allowed to start with, their points they're allowed to spend, and the 5 attributes they're allowed to put those points in. And in the brief descriptions of those points, it should at least inform the player, when they build their character, as to what kind of character they want to play, or what kind of character they would like to have exist in this world, to empower their fictional narration, or to empower their place in the world, right? To give them some sense that they can be who they want to be without a class, without, say, a profession, without a written capsule of what you can and cannot do, so to speak. So, for instance, and they're all, well, not all, but one is in particularly weighted differently. For instance, prestige. The nature of this being a feudal system and the nature of our social classes, 0 prestige. You're not going to work around that 0 prestige, right? A 0 prestige means you are a peasant. You're a lowborn. You're not going to be able to bandy about your power socially. You're not going to be able to you will not be able to seek audience with particular people. You will be frowned upon or looked down at or not even allowed into the premises, etc., etc. So prestige is one of those things in our game that is solely, it's just one of the 5 attributes, but it's actually, not only is it the attribute, but it's also part of the social paradigm. And therefore, you can't, as a character, you cannot outplay your prestige, right? And you really cannot underplay your prestige. So if you pick a character with high prestige, the GM will acknowledge that value by having people recognize you, or having people bow to you, or having people call you by a particular your lord or your ladyship or whatever, right? Depending on what your character's repute is, right? So if somebody says I have a prestige of 3, but I'm a druid that lives in the woods, that prestige might be mostly how your character is well known, but he may not have a noble rank, but he would be any court in the area would ask them to the court and bring them in house as an advisor, regardless of their station, is as far as where they live, how they live, their spiritual connection, right? Because the prestige is the value they're going to need to get into those situations. And you might well be, for instance, Merlin living in a hole, banging around, and every once in a while Merlin shows up in the court of King Arthur to give advice or to provide a service, or etc., etc. And everyone knows Merlin, but Merlin doesn't necessarily command any more ability over other kings and barons, etc., right? So prestige in a way is different, and we have not set it aside in the 5 attributes that way, but because that score immediately tells you your social rank and your where you are in the world, whether you like it or not, which is kind of neat. But what I mean by that is, for instance, you could have a 0 spirit and you can drop to the ground and pray, and depending on circumstances and how you define that, the GM may actually say, you are reaching for a miracle here, a peasant Joe, go ahead and make a spirit check. You're just not going to get a bonus because you have no spirit rating. But having the rating is not just a bonus; it is also a reflection of where your character is in the world. So even though I may not be a priest and have a spirit of 2, I would be in a way devout, or at least there would be a semblance of that my character maybe is going to be weighted in the realm of divinity or spirituality more than the guy with a 1 or a 0, right? So there is a relativity to the value of your spirit, although you may just be a knight or you may just be a peasant with a high spirit, right? You are entirely in control of the kind of character you want to put in the world. How you choose those 5 attributes really helps define that role for the player, if the player is capable of seeing them other than a bonus to win dice checks, right? Okay, so for instance, last night I made a Prestige 2, Spirit 2 canter. And then the repute, his 4 repute, I explained, comes from works he's done on behalf of the church. I didn't have to get into details. It just meant that I've worked my way up through the church doing things that maybe at the end of his life when he dies, he might even be put up to be canonized, right, as a saint. In other words, maybe I've worked miracles in the church in my 4 repute, right? Who knows, right? I didn't define that. I just defined that I did good deeds. I did things on behalf of the church and God. But the prestige insinuates a higher birthplace, right? So my character wasn't a peasant who worked his way into the church, etc. He was born at a higher caste and then higher class and chose the profession of the church. So you can really play with those numbers at least in your head as to what that one body looks like. What does that one body? Is it athletic? Is it strong? Is it just well? Is it just a healthy person? Right? Is it my body of 0? Does it mean I'm crippled? Does it mean I am malnourished? Does it mean I am underweight, or whatever you want to come up with, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be defined immediately, but so the mechanisms are in place, and the entire game you derive as a player, putting your character into the space, in the fiction, and declaring action versus looking at mechanics to do a thing, right? So one of the things Dell and I have talked about before, and I've talked about I think a little bit last night, I would argue two things occur when you pick up a game. Players read the rules and they say, okay, these are the things I can do. These are the mechanics that I've got to try to trigger in play. Even if they're not consciously thinking that way, they are aware that the thief can hide in shadows, can climb walls, can pick locks, can pickpocket. And so the guy who picks thief is looking at that backstab, right? He's looking at that hide in shadows, and he's looking for ways to live out the thief through these mechanisms, as opposed to just playing the thief and declaring what you're doing. I am slinking into the dark along the wall, trying not to be seen, staying out of the shadow, out of the light of the torches. And the GM would cue the GM that yes, you're hiding in shadows. Now he may make a roll to see how successfully you are hidden from the guards, or how quiet you are, or he may ask you to make the roll, etc. But the gist of it is, are they declaring it? Or are they just saying, I want to hide in shadows here, right? Okay. Now, if I'm a thief and I do that, it activates a mechanism, right? And that mechanism is hide in shadows, sneak, whatever it is, okay. But let's say I'm just a fighter and I say the same thing. There's no mechanism to promise that. There's no mechanism. It becomes a want or a desire that that mechanically is not supported. Therefore, the GM is put in a situation to say, "Of course you are," or make a roll and I'll modify it down, or no problem, you can easily hide in shadows here, and we have now a problem. The advent of this mechanism, the literal meaning in which the mechanism is supposed to be applied to a class like the thief, cannot then be bandied about in relationship to how the other classes should impact a scene or impact play. However, we do it. We do it all the time, right? Because we don't want to say to a player, you can't hide in shadows, dude. You're not a thief, right? Okay. Now, what am I getting at? I'm making a point that when we see a mechanism as a player, we think, okay, this is how I impact the game. This is how I'm going to call dice in a play. This is how I'm going to impact the board game. This is how I'm going to impact the game portion. And we either start thinking in alignment with what can I do, what can't I do, or we start looking at the mechanisms and the opportunity of success versus failure, etc. Right? And therefore, we talk about character poisoning all the time, and I think this is fascinating. I have colleagues and friends that have talked about character poisoning, and we see it all the time. And I've seen it since I was a kid, and you see it all the time, even with adults. But I think it's ironic we never talk about mechanics poisoning, right? We never refer to what happens when a player is obsessed with their skills, and that's poisoning every decision they make. It's poisoning every action they take. What happens when we see mechanics poisoning? What happens when every single combat the thief player says, can I backstab? Am I hiding in shadows? Can I backstab? Can I hide in shadows? Can I backstab? Right? That to me is mechanics poisoning, and I think it is as detrimental to the goal of being characters in a world, whether we're playing OD&D or whether we're playing a narrative-based game where we tell the tale of what we're about, right? So we look at our game, and Dale and I talk about this, and one of the goals of our game is to strip away that issue, right? Simplify it to the 5 attributes that now you decide what that character looks like. You decide what that character is in Dredgewater, and then ultimately, so there is some level of repute in which you have to explain. Therefore, we're asking you to create a background that would make sense of your 3 repute. Therefore, we're asking you to have a little bit of character poisoning. We're actually asking you, you have 3 repute for a reason. Now, if you tell me you slayed the dragon and you're level 3 repute, we'll probably have to talk that down. We're going to have to bring you off the ledge a little bit there, right? You've gone a little too far. But I have not yet seen anybody take liberties with those descriptions now. But that's not to say it wouldn't happen. So the gist of it is, so we strip away the sense that there's mechanics I can and cannot do, as opposed to I'm a human being who acts and reacts, and I'm a human being with motivations. I am a creature of the world and of the time and of the place and of the era, and therefore I'm going to put myself in that mindset, and I'm going to interact with the world and my fellow mates, and there's going to be times in which it triggers the mechanic that, and the triggering of that mechanic could either be automatic because your prestige is a 4. There's no question when you bark orders for the house, the cabin boy, to let you into the captain's cabin. No question, he's terrified of you. You have a prestige of 4. You're a nobleman. He lets you into the captain's cabin, and you find the captain has had a heart attack, right? No question, we're not going to make a die roll there, right? It's the weight of your prestige or the weight of your intimidation, etc. Right? Or we make a simple roll, or he sets a difficulty level commiserate with the situation, with the entire situation, right? Hopefully never one-on-one unless it is just a one-on-one interaction. If it's a party and we're in a combat, all things should be affecting the weight of the difficulty bubble, right? And we should call it a bubble because that bubble shrinks or expands to difficulty based on the entire environment of what is occurring among all the players at the table and the combatants in the combat or negotiative table or whatever we're doing. Okay. So with that said, we have one mechanic, and that's okay with me, right? I mean, the goal there is the mechanic has to be brought into play when there is something in question. That mechanic has a pass-fail. There is no stalemate, right? And there's always a consequence for demanding the roll. There should be a reason we're rolling, and then there should be a consequence for the dice check, right? Whether it's a positive effect upon the player or a negative effect upon the player. And that can be also expanded to be a negative effect on somebody else in the party, if not a direct impact on the failed dice roll. I could fail an attack with my character and suffer a wound, but I could fail the attack with my character and someone else in the party suffer, right? So again, because it becomes this fictional shared narrative tactical space, right? Now, whether this is, again, a dance, whether this is combat, whether this is negotiating, bartering, whether this is constructing a siege weapon as engineers, right? All of these things come into place to decide whether we get the siege weapon built properly. Does it function? And, who knows how to do this thing, etc., etc., right? So, as opposed to class or profession or skills in which we are compelled to say, without the skill, you're going to have to take a Hail Mary here. Without the skill, you cannot do it. Or with the skill, you can do it with a level of proficiency, etc., etc. There's all kinds of ways to argue how we can utilize skills effectively in skill-based games, and I do not disagree with that. What I'm saying is, it's all a matter of what's the term I'm looking for? It's all a matter of semantics, right? I can always find an excuse to justify the mechanic. I can also find an excuse to say the mechanic is in the way or wasteful, right? So we have to decide, in the grand scheme of the game and of the nature of what we're trying to achieve and what the GM is trying to adjudicate, the mechanics become first and foremost our interaction with each other and with the table and with the world, right? Okay. So with that being said, I think our game is expressing that. We've had now, I don't know how many different people I've played with, 1, 2, 7, 8, about 12 different people have play tested our game, almost all of them multiple times. And we have never encountered, I think, a dilemma with somebody not understanding the value of their character, not understanding their place in the world, not are failing to understand that they are alive in a live world and they are reacting and acting, and not concerned about what they can and cannot do, not concerned about whether mechanics support it, right? And I think in that sense, our game is achieving its purpose, right? How much you want, how tactical you want it, how cumbersome you want it, how many layer and subset of rules you need to mix the potion versus not mixing the potion. A GM in our game can say, when Joe says, I'm going to mix up a remedy for the king who's dying with this thing, the GM can say tell me how that goes, and then have them make one roll, or the GM can say you're going to have to find the herbs, and that's a roll, and then you're going to have to mix it. You got to cook it now. Now you got to test it. Who are you going to ask to taste this? You could have a hierarchy of tests depending on how important this concoction is to saving the king's life, right? And I like that. I like that idea that the GM can set the weight. The player can set the weight, or the weight is set. The king is dying, and this is something that you've never seen before. And you've got to figure out how you want to go about dealing with this. And one guy says, I just want to be prepared to take his, to hear his sins, and to grant him a pathway to God. I'm only concerned about his soul, and so I will kneel by the bed, and I will be there for him. I'm not worried about saving the king. I'm worried about saving his soul. And Joe says, dude, I'm gonna do whatever it takes. I'm drawing on all my herbology and all of what I've witnessed in my life as to what this could be. And I want to get to work on this. And now, right, we step up a notch. And then the player says, your ladyship, I think I can save the king. Okay, now we've escalated with the actual expression of this to loved one. I can save the king. We now increase the weight of this, right? Do we allow the king to die because we have no power over it and it's nobody's responsible? And the minute a player says, your ladyship, I think I can save the king, give me time to mix a concoction, now we up the ante on this whole scene, because somebody stepped up to take responsibility, and therefore this becomes a pivotal moment in the fiction. It becomes a pivotal moment in the game that it does not have to be defined before we start. It doesn't have to be defined at all. It can come up in a random seed. The king is dying. The players can ignore that. The players can dive into that, or the players can say, we want to save the king. That becomes the thing, right? So one of the things I want to talk about in this video is aimless playing. And aimless sounds bad, right? Random sounds normal. We talk about random all the time. We use random dice. We use random wandering monsters. We use random events. We use random things. But that's okay. But I want to use the term here, aimless. There should be a sense of aimless, not goalless. The goals come as the players are in the world and witnessing something they want to deal with, or suffering something they need to ratify or rectify, or right. So we're not talking goalless, right? Because the players will decide their goals, the motivations, right. Now I can set up that the Baron has demanded you to go do this because you're a serf and you have a fealty to the Lord. And so you can decide not to, and then you become outlaws, and then you're dealt with. And okay, that's all fantastic, because the players decide the goal. The players decide the motivation. The players drive the ship, so to speak. So I'm referring to aimless gaming in the sense that we do not have a story that we're trying to express. We do not have a goal that we're trying to. This is not Adventure Night where I say to 5 players, "Thank you for showing up tonight." And you're gonna go deal with the temple of the elemental ape, and at some point you're gonna face the elemental ape at the end of in the temple chamber, and it's an adventure night, and there is a story, and there is a goal, and this is what you're going to do, and there's nothing wrong with that. We're talking about finding out through seeds, organic seeds that pop up, right? Either from thoughts, or from the tables, or from a character saying, you know what, I really want that. I need a sword. I do not want to go off and do this without a sword. And then the party says, well, we got to get him a sword, It's not about a shopping trip, right? It's about saying, I've got to find the blacksmith. Where's the blacksmith? Well, the blacksmith, it's a holiday. Blacksmith's not here, but he does have a home supposedly out in the woods. And you roll a random seed, and the random seed says flood, and as they travel through the woods to get the blacksmith, right, a catastrophic flood occurs, and they witness his cabin ripped off its moorings, and now they're trying to save the blacksmith who's caught in the flood. And because that is a random seed that occurs, now I can tie the flood to everybody, or I can just tie it to them witnessing the cabin of the blacksmith, right, torn off its moorings, and it's gone. And now they're trying desperately to save themselves, or save those who are trapped in the flood, or literally save the blacksmith. And later that becomes a bargaining chip. We saved you. I want a sword. I think you should, for your life, I think you should make me a sword. And then we get an interesting play there, right? And where does that lead, right? So we talk about organic play coming out of live expression of the fiction, who our characters are in the world, what's happening around us that we respond to. We have to have a give and take response, right? And then how things occur in an aimless way. They actually are aimless, but they never lead to aimless endings. They never lead to aimless meanderings and wanderings. They actually create emergent story. Emergent play creates emergent story, and at the end of the night we scratch our heads and go, how did that happen? How did those two things come together to create this thing? And we ended up with this amazing tale that none of us had any indication were coming, right? And I've got ample examples of that occurring in all of my naive narrator sessions, private, locally, and with online, with Dell, etc., from all kinds of different systems. I used Modern Age with Naive Narrator. I've used Wild West with Naive Narrator. I've used White Box with Naive Narrator. I've used, gosh, I can't remember what else. Warlock with Naive Narrator, and oh man, what else? Everything I've been running with Naive Narrator in the last 6 months, and from that, it has instantly created, I think, a more liberating, but also a freer sense that the players almost instinctually know that the world is alive, and they just don't know what's coming, and they can kind of decide what's of value, but they don't know what's going to happen. They don't know what's coming, versus the traditional, I don't know what's behind the door on the right, and I don't know what's if I go left through at the crossroads of the dungeon, or if I go through this door. Sure, there's a mystery and a little bit of trepidation because you don't know what's behind door A and you don't know what's down left corridor. But there is this sense that you're going to have to go one of those ways, and you're going to have to find out one of those things. Versus the idea that we don't know, and that the players can make value of that, right? They decide the value, the weight of that thing. And this is incredibly complicated to talk about because I'm not certain the vocabulary. I'm not certain the best way to describe it. So again, I think aimless gaming in a way is the goal. And I won't say random gaming. I mean aimless. We do not have an aim. It's like aimless conversation. You sit down at a public library, and you somehow strike up a conversation with somebody because you're waiting for somebody to come in and deposit your test for some license you're trying to achieve, and you end up in kind of an aimless conversation with Joe, and from that conversation you find out you know somebody, and you share something, and from this aimless conversation comes an interesting moment in your life that may or may not be pointless, may have point, may have no point, may just be an aimless conversation. But you don't sit down to say, we're going to discuss purchasing your car today, Joe, to the stranger, right? When I go into a dealership and I say, I want that car, we sit down, and it's not an aimless conversation. We're trying to achieve a contract to get the car, right? I don't want my gaming to be a contract to get the car, right? I want it to be aimless, right? And if that sounds strange or weird, I don't know how else to express it. It's not about railroading. That's been a term that we have buried. I mean, we have absolutely destroyed. And I think it's become easy to say, well, railroading is this thing. Well, I would argue if there is a plan, in any way, a plan, right, then we are not railroaded. Because again, I think that's harsh. Railroad now has become this idea of that you have no choices at all. Well, I think you have a lot of choices. I used to run sandbox games. I had to have a choice in every direction, but it was kind of there, right? It wasn't, if they traveled west and went to the lair of the Rabbit King, they were going to deal with the lair of the Rabbit King, as opposed to me rolling a random seed that says a Rabbit King is heard to be in the area west of the region. We're all going, what's the Rabbit King, right? What does the Rabbit King mean, right? And the players decide, Rabbit King, I gotta see this, right? And they end up in the Monty Python situation where the rabbit tears the throats out, right? The crazy rabbit. whatever, right? Or the Rabbit King because he's the best hunter of rabbits. It turns out he's just some hunter who lives in a hovel and he's got rabbit pelts everywhere, and they call him the Rabbit King because that's all he eats and that's all he hunts and it's all he, and they're thinking literally a Rabbit King, right? No, it's some knucklehead peasant who lives in the woods and he has a nickname, right? And what comes from that? Those adventures. What comes from that realization that the Rabbit King isn't what we thought it was, or the Rabbit King is something far more dangerous than we ever dreamed of, or whatever, right? And the decisions the players make and the characters, as the characters move through those spaces in an aimless way, we end up with a story. We end up with a beginning, a middle, and an end purely based on active play and seeds that organically pop up that may or may not sidetrack the players, or may or may not become a goal of the players, or may or may not even be interested by the players, right? Or interesting to the players. Anyway, thank you for listening.